Welcome to the Walled Garden Podcast. Here we nourish the gardens of our minds, one meaningful conversation at a time. If you'd like to find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. So, as you may hear, I've got a bit of a cold, so you'll have to put up with my croaky voice in this intro. But today I'm actually sitting here in an empty home. My wife and I have just finished cleaning up our apartment. The only thing that's left in here is a couple of bags on the kitchen table, and we are just about to head up to my family's home, about half an hour away, and then tomorrow we'll be flying down to Sydney and seeing some more family down there, and then Friday we will be flying over to California to really restart our lives over in America, to go on a grand adventure over there. And this is my last episode that I'll be recording in this beautiful home that we've set up here in Australia. And the next time you hear this voice, I will be over with many of you who I know are over there in America. And to all of my Australian listeners, I'm sorry for deserting this beautiful country. Jen and I have been here for about 6 years now. Obviously, I've lived here on the Sunshine Coast my whole life. But this has just been such a beautiful time in our lives. And we had always planned to go over to America. And it took a little bit longer than expected. But so it's a bittersweet time, on the one hand, we are very sad to leave this place. We both agree that it's, you really can't get better than the Sunshine Coast, Australia. But nonetheless, to all of my American listeners, I want to say that I am just so excited to get over there and to really dive into the American culture. I already feel like I know America quite well, simply because, obviously I'm married to an American, and I've spent a little bit of time over there. And also many of the people who I admire and listen to are in America and even in California. And it's very exciting to both Jen and I to really pack up and head over there and see what we can make of being in America. It's an incredible country. I have a lot of respect and love for the American people, and I just want to say that I'm excited to come over there and spend time with you all. And Sharon and I have already discussed the potential of putting together some sort of live walled garden show together, and so that's an exciting thing that you can keep in the back of your mind that isn't in the works yet, but we're putting our plans together. Now, I really don't have a lot of time today. There's so much that I would have loved to say in this last episode before I head to America, but with the time constraints, I'm going to move straight on to introducing our guest for today. And I do apologize also for the croaky voice. I think over these past few weeks, my immune system has slowly been depleting, as I've been, finishing 3 courses at university and taking on a whole bunch of new people into the walled garden and moving and getting everything ready. And now I'm kind of suffering the consequences. But nonetheless, the guest who we have on today's show, it was a real pleasure having this person on the show. His name is Dr. Mark Vernon. Now, I'd like to thank Kai Whiting for contacting Dr. Mark Vernon and getting him on the show, because this was just such a profound conversation. Some of you were there live as we were having this conversation, and it was great to see you there. And this was recorded a few months ago. So I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Mark Vernon, and then we will dive straight into the conversation. So Mark is a psychotherapist and a writer with an interest in ancient philosophy and a focus on the skills and insights that illuminate our inner lives. His books cover subjects from friendship and belief to well-being and love. His most recent books are Dante's Divine Comedy, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey, and A Secret History of Christianity, which is based upon the ideas of the Oxford Inkling, Owen Barfield. He contributes to and has presented a number of programs on the radio and writes as a journalist, with his work being published by the BBC, Aeon, Church Times, and elsewhere. He teaches at the Idler Academy and also leads workshops and gives talks. As a psychodynamic psychotherapist, he has a private practice in London, working with individuals who have a variety of concerns, and he's also worked at the Maudsley Hospital in South London in the personality disorder service. So with all that said, this conversation today is really based around his work with Dante's Divine Comedy. It was such a beautiful and, as I said earlier, a profound learning experience for all who were there in that conversation, and I'd like to thank Mark for coming on the show. I know he's a busy person and extremely sought after as well. And we really hope to have him back as many times as possible, because the sorts of spiritual knowledge and understanding that he is trying to gain and also it really touches on in his work is just extremely helpful, and it's deep and it's enriching is the right word there. And so with all of that said, I'm looking forward to speaking to you from California. And for now, enjoy this episode with Dr. Mark Vernon. Mark, I just want to say welcome to the Walled Garden. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Your work is extremely deep and profound and very meaningful. And I want to say it actually wasn't until a few days ago that I realized that I had spent much more time with you in my ears than I had previously recognized, because I've listened to all of your conversations with Rupert Sheldrake, and I've thoroughly enjoyed those. And so I just want to make a recommendation to everybody, apart from obviously getting Mark's book, Dante's Divine Comedy, The Path of... what's the complete title there?
No worries. So it's a guide to the spiritual journey.
That's it, a guide to the spiritual journey.
Emphasize tracking Dante's perceptual transformation rather than, say, the history or the literature or whatever.
Yes, and I've been working my way through that and have found it extremely insightful. But I did want to say to everybody, if you want a great jumping off point, there's some great conversations between Mark and Rupert Sheldrake on this book as well, where you can get a bit of an overview for what you're about to handle. But Mark, I want to let you introduce yourself to everybody and tell us who you are, what you do, why you do it, perhaps, and then I want to dive into exactly what you just said, that perceptual transformation, because it's extremely fascinating. So, welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, look, thank you for inviting me, and for those who reached out and have made this possible. I'm a psychotherapist based in the UK. But write books, articles, do stuff online, not least with Rupert Sheldrake. And it's very much born of my own struggle to make sense of spiritual life in the 21st century. I used to be an Anglican priest. I did a PhD on Plato. My engagement with Stoicism, in a way, is a bit oblique, in that it was through Jules Evans originally, who's well known in the modern Stoicism movement. And Jules is a friend. And I was always sort of coming from the Platonic point of view, but realized that by the time of the emergence of Christianity, Platonism and Stoicism in what's called Middle Platonism was already, quite merged, but certainly in dialogue. But have always been interested in the reason why I've ended up being a psychotherapist is because I feel that psychotherapy is a modern tradition that resonates with these ancient traditions, that tries to understand what's going on inside you so that you can become more resonant with what's going on inside elsewhere. And the Stoic sense of things, not just to understand your own inner life, but how that then helps you to understand the inner life of the world, of the cosmos. it was always important to me.
Oh man, we have so much to dive into. There's so much there, and I've even written down questions regarding that idea that we can dive into the cosmos by diving into ourselves and gaining that inner knowledge. But Kai, you've raised your hand, so I'm gonna bring you in here, and I'm gonna bite my tongue until you've asked your questions, and then I'll dive in with all my crazy thoughts.
No, I just wanted to say what interested me personally about Mark's work is that he, much before a lot of other people, was highlighting the significance and the importance of the divine in Stoicism, and how certain people within the contemporary Stoic community, particularly the modern Stoic movement, was quote unquote missing the point. So that's the kind of reason that I myself was interested in Mark's work. I have to say, I think it's very underrated. I think that we need more of Mark's work in contemporary Stoicism. I know that Mark has moved towards other directions, but personally, I think if you haven't heard of Mark and you haven't read his work on Stoicism, then I think you're doing yourself a disservice personally, because I think it is a very interesting perspective, and I do think that Mark's much more deeper understanding of Christian theology than I could ever hope to have comes through. And if you are Christian, or you have Christian leanings, or you're just interested in the Christian/Stoic worldview and how they are linked to some degree, I think that Mark's work is a good point that to start. And you probably have come across, if you have been in the Stoic community for a while, his work in the modern Stoicism. I can't remember which volume 1 or 2 where there is a debate. I won't spoil that debate, but a lot of people might have already read that work and just not realized that Mark is well known in Stoic circles. It just has been in other circles recently. But I just wanted to highlight that he's not a new member. He's been there a long, long time.
Yeah, man, that is so cool. And you're right, Kai, because I really didn't realize it. And I mean, I'm not usually the person going looking for academic articles, anyway. But nonetheless, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to explore your work even more after this, Mark. But I want to dive in with this idea of the spiritual transformation, or the shift in perception, because I had a conversation with Sharon LaBelle recently talking about my own book that I've recently published, The Poet and the Sage. And one of the things that I said to Sharon in there, I've been trying to catch up with the spiritual path, because it kind of just happens, and then you have to put the pieces together and be like, what's happening to me here? And one of the things that I remember saying to Sharon was I felt as though through writing that book, there was a metaphysical shift for me, where all of a sudden I was not in the same location as I was before writing the book. I wasn't in the same perception or consciousness, and there were many things changing that were kind of confusing to me. And through listening to your work on Dante's Divine Comedy, it just keeps on bringing up this idea that the spiritual path is one of a shift in consciousness. And I think for many people, especially those who perhaps haven't undergone some sort of spiritual transformation, that's an extremely confusing, perhaps even a wild, crazy, insane proposition that you would have a shift in consciousness. Could you maybe talk a little bit about this idea that the spiritual path will change the reality that you see?
Yeah. Well, maybe I could talk about it as a historical phenomenon, but also then as a personal one. Because as Kai mentioned, this is all quite, for me, connected to my relationship with Christianity. And it was realizing that consciousness changes across periods of cultural time. By that I mean the way that people experience themselves, their relationship to others, their relationship to gods, and then God changes over kind of the periods of hundreds of years, kind of generational time, that happens. And I think that the story of Stoicism is absolutely part of that shift, particularly in relation to the Logos, so that you can move from Heraclitus talking about listening to the Logos and seeing that all is one, through the various Stoics, who of course in the ancient world even existed over quite a long period of time, hundreds of years, into the Middle Platonic period, and then into Christianity, where there was this sense that somehow the Logos had been fully incarnate in a person, and so could be known inside of us too. So that's about individual perception shifting as much as just some playing with the idea of the Logos, and broadly speaking, through another really key guide for me, Owen Barfield, the great friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, that it was with the emergence of individuality, which I think was one of the key things that happened with the emergence of monotheism, because when you can see there's something unified within yourself, you can then feel that mirrored or reflected inside yourself. And it's only with the two aspects that monotheism becomes possible. So that reflecting on the Logos was really crucial part of that. So that happened across the period from, the pre-Socratics through the emergence of Christianity, and then continued a course apace after the Christian emergence as well. That's one side of it. So you can sort of look back in history and see how spiritual perception changes. That's very fascinating to do. But then also, this became a living reality for me more personally. I mean, one could talk about it in lots of different ways, but one way was actually through my own therapy, my own psychotherapy. And, this directly links to ancient practices. Psychotherapy is quite monastic in its form in a way. Certainly I had quite a traditional analysis where I went to see my therapist the same times every week, for many years, as it turned out. And it's by speaking out, confessing, that things start to emerge and change, and dots get joined and so on. But one of the things that became clear to me then, which was quite a surprise, was how time can be experienced in lots of different ways for us. We can experience time as clock time. It's what got us all together from the four corners of the globe at the same time, and that's useful. But time too can take on different experiences for us when we realize, for example, that in our psyches, in inner life, what happened decades ago even can be quite as alive as what happened just yesterday. And that's something that psychotherapy takes for granted, that what happens in your early life can affect the whole of your life. It doesn't just fade away across chronological time, but stays vibrant in what you might call chirological time. And then there's the sense of timelessness that emerges when you realize that. Once you start to realize that the experience of time is flexible, and you start even to be able to feel you can navigate across different experiences of time, you realize there's a kind of space or a container for time that is timeless. And so in Plato, you have the sense that time is the moving image of eternity. Even in ancient philosophers like Epicurus, so-called materialists, although I think one would need to qualify that now too, but nonetheless, he was celebrated as being able to move right across the cosmos, across time, in Lucretius's great poem. And so that kind of spiritual perception that you can read about in the great sages of the ancient world, and of course in saints and mystics since, one can know that directly oneself with the appropriate practices. And there may be practices that are not just about managing life now, as a sort of self-help kind of stoicism might offer, which isn't to be sniffed at, because when you're suffering, it's good to have things to help manage that. But nonetheless, there's something much deeper that becomes visible too, which puts, in my mind, stoicism within this family of spiritual practices that are about expanding your awareness of the way the cosmos works, not just getting through the day.
Okay, I have too many questions to try and put together here based on what you just said. Wow, yeah, this idea, I think you're exactly right. The practical elements of any philosophy must be brought forth for the people who really need it. But when you talk about this idea that we can perceive elements of the cosmos within us, or we can, there's this idea in Stoicism, obviously, that, it's that the view from above, going above the world, looking down, and that should give us some sort of peace through meditation from that level. But I think that, to your point, something that I've really noticed in the Stoics is, I think that that's an idea that you can't fully comprehend until you have that same sort of spiritual process within you, where you start to perceive a little bit deeper what they're talking about. Because even Seneca talks about that, going above the world and, almost like dancing among the stars and seeing the movements of the heavenly bodies and, peering into the cosmos. He literally says things like that, looking into the inner workings of nature. And you think, this is not simply somebody sitting there thinking, okay, I'm going to visualize myself above the earth and I'm going to find, no, there's a shift in their reality there, where they feel as though they are truly, or to your words, the world is being revealed to them through this this spiritual path. And I wonder, I don't know exactly how this relates, but I want to ask you this. I've been really fascinated by this idea in Orthodox Christianity, although it flows all throughout. You may know somebody called Jonathan Pajot. He's very interesting. You've heard of him, the icon carver. For anybody who hasn't listened to his work, please check it out. But he's really brought me around to this idea that there is almost this cosmic map within Christianity through icons and symbolism, and even within Dante's Divine Comedy. I see these beautiful images that people have painted throughout history of this divine mountain, some of them kind of going up to a peak, some of them opening up almost in an upside down pyramid to reveal the world. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that idea that this knowledge of the cosmic structure is something that we can perceive within ourselves, almost as a map of what reality is like within and without of ourselves. I don't know if I formulated that question right, but I'll throw it over to you anyway.
No, thank you. Let me try and say something and see whether it connects with what you're thinking. Yeah. I mean, I listen to Jonathan Pajot with great interest, and of course his podcast is called The Symbolic World, and I think he does it primarily through understanding symbols and seeing how symbols are almost like archetypal patterns that you can see playing out even in the news, let alone in one's personal life. That's one way of doing it. For me, as a psychotherapist, maybe it's more about sympathies that one tunes into. I mean, maybe if I talk about when I was writing my book on the Divine Comedy, one of the great challenges was what sense to make of the paradise, which incidentally I really wanted to make sense of, because everyone goes for the Inferno and says how illuminating that is. And it strikes me as seriously depressing that when it comes to the paradise, no one knows what quite to make of it, when Dante was quite clear that's where the truth is. But one of the great challenges is how to make sense of his ascending through the heavens, which in the first stage of that is ascending through the planetary spheres. And so they ascend through the sphere of the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Jupiter, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And, a kind of mechanistic model of the cosmos, which is the one that dominates today, can't really make any sense of that at all. Except then you start to think, well, maybe what he's talking about are qualities of reality that these different planets and the stars share with us. But because they aren't human and so don't have the kind of expansive consciousness of which we're aware of, each planetary sphere reflects one particular aspect of the divine life. And so when, as it were, a figure like Dante looks at, say, the sun, he doesn't just see, he doesn't see our nearest star at all. What he sees is a quality of light that resonates with the light that is within him and highlights a certain side to that light. And he explains it as he sees it in the Divine Comedy, which is that in the sphere of the sun, he meets great luminaries. You notice all these words that mean light, both physically and spiritually, still remembered in our language. He meets great luminaries who, during their mortal lives, spoke with great brilliance, I'm using the word deliberately, about their spiritual perceptions. Incidentally, they're not just Christians, they're Christians and Islamic thinkers as well. By this stage, he's realizing that any particular tradition doesn't have a monopoly on insight. But what he also realizes is that while these figures disagreed on earth as they championed their own light, what they know now in the sphere of the sun is that their stellar light, if you like, was just an echo or reflection of the divine light, refracted through their particular insights. Now, it's in the sphere of the sun because the sun is the brightest light in the sky during our mortal lives and during our sort of earthly perception, if you like. And so these figures like Thomas Aquinas and others were the great, big theological voices of Dante's time, and so spoke with the light like the sun that seemed to illuminate the whole landscape. But he also realizes that these lights that competed now were actually channeling a subtler light, which was the divine light, where differences can combine, where opposites come together. And so the sun is also a kind of pivotal light for him. And if you can let go of what seems to be so bright and obvious and clear, and allow shadows and subtlety, which the sun's light might even blast temporarily, and so you lose sight of them, then you can track the lesser lights of divine reality. And so that leads him into the lesser lights, particularly of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so it means that he can move into a different kind of light, a different planetary sphere. And that strikes me as a brilliant psychological perception, as much as a way of experiencing traveling through the cosmic lights. And because, you know, someone that walks into your therapy room absolutely sure that they've got themselves right, there may well be truth in that, but you realize that there's also something troubling them that's brought you into the room. And so part of your task is going to be to help them see beyond just what seems so bright and self-evident to them now, to start to track the subtler lights that are alive inside them. And so when you get this kind of sympathy sense going inside you, you start to realize how in the medieval mind and before, no doubt, the lights in the world around weren't just seen as kind of physical sources of energy, but were seen as living with the same spirit that you knew inside yourself. And by contemplating the different lights, you too could go on a journey through these different spheres that were at once part of the macrocosm and the microcosm inside. So I think that is what figures meant when they found themselves journeying through the cosmos. It's through a process of sympathy. So similarly, you know, like the dream of Scipio, this and what you're referring to, the kind of ascending to see the world beneath you, and so getting the experience subspecie eternitatis. It's that you use the language metaphorically. You pull back from your own life and draw more in, and then you pull back again and draw more in. And you know, we can do that in our minds. And so in the medieval world before, when it was quite natural to feel that your life was part of cosmic life and divine life, to experience that as pulling away from the surface of mortal earth through the luminary spheres and so on, it all comes together. Now we can. it's not natural for us to think like that, because if you've done any physics at all, the cosmos is explained to you in very, very different ways. But I did a physics degree actually as an undergraduate back in the 1980s, and
is there anything
that's
you
long
haven't
enough
done
ago now just to realize that physics changes pretty fast. It's not quite year by year, but certainly decade by decade, and it's now quite common for really prominent physicists to talk about the cosmos in relational terms. And relational terms are not a million miles away from sympathetic terms. And so I suspect that, our experience of the cosmos will change very dramatically over the next period, and maybe in 100 or 200 years' time. A lot of these ancient ways of talking about things will make a lot more sense. Someone said to me just the other day, actually, that Plato's Timaeus, which is sort of his cosmological treatise, he thought that Plato would have a much easier time with modern physics than, say, Newton would, because Newton was rather inclined to think in these fixed ways, whereas Plato knew that he was telling a likely story, as he puts it in the Timaeus. He knew that he was trying to come up with some sort of sense of relationality, and beauty and aesthetics would guide him through the cosmos quite as much. And that, I think, connects much more directly with modern physics than even Newtonian physics might.
Wow.
Mark, I've just been getting goosebumps listening to you speak, because in a different nomenclature, it's as if you're talking to me in the language of Jewish mysticism, the Sephirotic tree, and as discussed in the Zohar. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that into the mix, because it's kind of stunning to me what you're saying, mutatis mutandis.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's right. And particularly the way that the Sephirotic tree now is layered. So there's often 4 trees, aren't there? And the pinnacle of one leads you into the root of another. And so there's a sense of ascent. I think that it's capturing the same dynamic for sure. Yeah.
Well, to that point, Sharon, I mean, like, I'm sitting here, just so excited listening to these words. I can't tell if it's the coffee or Mark's words, but it's, what's coming to me right now is there is such profound truth in that idea you find in the Bible of those who have ears to hear, eyes to see. If you have traveled to a certain point along this spiritual path, many of these ideas, which once would have seemed cuckoo or insane or out of place, now start to fall into place in that, you might say, that symbolic world. And for me, one thing that's coming up is, Sharon, you know this, and anybody who's read my book, there's this idea that kept on coming in through my poetry of the sage is the one who reflects the light of the sun, reflects it on the world and illuminates the world in that way. And when you're saying, this relational element of us and the cosmos, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And maybe you could expand on this. I'll try to formulate a question here, but it became apparent to me that one of the important roles of the poet is to seek out those relations between us and the world around us through metaphor. How am I like the tree? How am I like the sun? How do I relate to this field, this, whatever it is? How do we as human beings relate to this? And I guess I want to pull you up on something that you said there and ask you to expand on it, because you mentioned that you feel as though we are about to head into a period where we will return to a lot of these ancient ways of thinking. Somebody else who is doing a lot of work in this exact field is obviously Jordan Peterson, who very much thinks in those archetypes, those profound religious ideas. And he once said something on Joe Rogan's podcast that as soon as he said it, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I thought, oh my gosh, all these pieces started to fall together, and I started to feel as though I actually understood a little bit more of what he was trying to do. Because Joe Rogan asked him, what do you think you're doing, man? What are you trying to do? And he said something like this: "Oh God, if I have to put it like this, I think I'm trying to resurrect the dormant logos." And as soon as he said that, I thought, whoa, because there's that idea in Christianity that there's going to be like a second coming where, the logos shall rise again. And to me, I don't necessarily see that as there's going to be a physical Christ come again who shows up in a chariot and starts judging everybody. To me, it's much more, well, and I want you to expand on this, like you say, there's going to be an apocalypse or a revealing of these deep truths about the reality of our existence here as it pertains to the Logos, this very all permeating land of meaning, you might say. And we're going to be judged essentially because it's going to come back and be like, this is reality and you didn't understand it. And now it's just going to slap you over the face. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit more? This idea that perhaps there is going to be almost like a resurrection of this ancient way of seeing the cosmos, seeing the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be a resurrection with difference. I think resurrection is always with difference, actually. But because I think if you're monotheist, there's always meaning. There's never not meaning. And even in the period of alienation and loss and death, all these traditions stress that death is the way. They don't just say there's a way around death or over death or under death. No, they say death is the way. And that's because the alienation, the loss, is a preparation for a return. And it can be experienced, I think, as terrifying, of course, because it really is death. It's not just like an uncomfortable moment. And so I think that's why a word like apocalypse is often used synonymous with kind of like descending horror or calamitous collapse or in more religious spheres, a kind of judgment where there's going to be some sort of separation and casting into outer darkness and so on. That language definitely exists in the Bible too, but that's because it's expressing the step before the true revelation, the true apocalypse, the true unveiling, which is the realization of what was lost, what was forgotten, that comes back with the transformation of the individual. And so, I mean, Jordan Peterson is such a fascinating figure because, my sense of him, for what it's worth, is that he is so powerful, not just for what he says, but because he sort of enacts the sense of alienation and struggle and wrestling in his very person. He projects it in his sort of agonistic attempt to understand what's going on, which produces insights. But it's the feel of listening to him as much as anything that I think speaks to the spirit of our times. That's authentic because he is precisely going through, I think, what Christianity and other traditions would tell us is the precursor to the unveiling, but which is also a return, but a return with difference. And in particular, I think that one of the things that has become clear across the course of the monotheistic period is that we as individuals are called to know the divine unity and to participate in divine life. In the Hebrew Bible, in the older bits of the Hebrew Bible, it's quite clear that individuals then felt when they died, they returned to their ancestors, they returned to a more collective sense of vitality. And you get it too in the ancient Greek texts, like in Homer, when Achilles goes to the underworld to find Patroclus, for example, in the Iliad, he's devastated to find that Patroclus is already fading as a shade. He's returning to the background life. Now that starts to change with the perception of monotheism, the individual personal resurrection starts to become conceivable. So I'm perhaps rambling a little bit now, but anyway,
rambling.
Your question, maybe just to say, your question I think is so fascinating because it is absolutely the vanguard of our struggle, not just to wander, but to actually start to see again. And certainly in the Christian tradition, resurrection I think is about having the eyes to see and ears to hear. It's why Jesus appears in all sorts of different ways in the New Testament accounts of the resurrection. It's not just like he shows up as if he's offering historical proof, as it's often said today. That's such a tragic misunderstanding of what resurrection is really about, as if it was some kind of fact that we're being caught with an iPhone, if only there was an iPhone there. It's much more about the disciples wrestling with seeing what's really going on, that then reveals this deeper reality. Something like that. Anyway, a few more thoughts.
I'll give fair warning to Sharon and Kai, because I really want you guys to dive in here and ask questions, but I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to ask one more and then I'm going to throw it over to you, whether you have questions or not. Right. But I have to ask this because I always thought, because I grew up with religion, but then it was more of a dogmatic faith. It was, well, I believe this because everybody else around me believes it. I had experiences of being brought into that tradition, but it's not their fault at all. I think it's just the natural course of things. Okay, you fall away, but then you start to see things come together again. But see, in my period of walking through the desert, you might say, it was always my opinion that, okay, if I was going to believe in God, it would be this point where I'd be like, okay, well, this fact lines up with this fact lines up with this fact. Okay, rationally, I can now conceive that this is, God makes sense now. That's the complete opposite. That's more of a propositional way of knowing God, whereas what you're speaking to is this experiential way of knowing God, where you're brought into an experience of the divine as an adventure almost, of climbing that ladder of divine ascent, you might say. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more to that idea that knowledge of God is not, just a quick side note there. What's even more disconcerting to me is, I'm actually studying a Master of Divinity now. Funny, you went from being a priest into psychology. I was very close to taking a psychology degree, but then I thought, no, I want to figure out the architecture of the soul. And to me, as an artist and poet, it made more sense to go into divinity, into sort of chaplaincy. But going into that, even seeing that some of my lecturers are like trying to reconcile faith with science and stuff like that, and they're not the same questions. they're not the same worlds. We don't necessarily have to do that, because it's a completely different thing that we're trying to do here. We're trying to have this experience. And could you maybe just speak to that, the difference between propositional knowledge of God as opposed to experiential? And then Kai and Sharon, jump in. It's all yours.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite lucky, because when I did my physics degree, my tutor was a chap called Carlos Frank, who's a cosmologist. And Carlos was always quite clear that physics was just one way of looking into the nature of reality, but also its brilliance, and its divine brilliance even. And it's one lens, but it's not the only lens. And so, although, I know that there are people that try to turn, certainly Christianity, into a science. I always realized there was more to science, not just more to religion than that. You might put it like that. But also another factor just to throw in is that the sense of Christianity coming to life again was as much enabled by wrestling with other traditions, that in some ways, you can feel a bit freer in other traditions, because you're not loaded with the institutional baggage or the varieties of Christianities around you, which can be, often off-putting, to be frank. And so, for example, I was lucky at a very seminal moment to join a reading group reading Ibn Arabi. And I remember learning, for example, how Ibn Arabi talks about voyaging in God, and how when you think you're voyaging away from God, you're actually discovering the extent of the divine even more. And so the magnitude of your sense of separation from the divine is actually the magnitude of the divine's reach towards you. And I remember hearing things like that, and it completely transformed for me the sense of alienation and what that might mean. It's actually, in one moment feels like a loss, but then in another moment feels like an expansion. And then these phrases, the idea of the names of God and how one can experience different facets of the divine by knowing what these names of God mean. And, they can mean the wonderful things that you automatically associate with the divine, like glory, but mercy too. And that comes out of the harder sides of life. That too is to know something of the divine. I don't know how many Muslims read Ibn Arabi, much as how many Christians read Meister Eckhart, or something like that. And it is one of the great, the good things about reaching into other traditions is that these mystical facets certainly show up to you elsewhere before you know them in your own tradition. But to come to your question, it put me directly onto how really knowing about the divine is not about rational calculation or making a best bet. It is experiential. And once you realize that not only can you take steps towards a wider experience that then starts to connect with what people have said about God, but that actually, of course, we're not separate from the cosmos, as is this modern scientific assumption, as if we've got this view from nowhere, we're outside. We are part of this too. It's in us quite as much as is in the stars. And so feeling the call of the cosmos, the call of the Logos, to cite Heraclitus, and of course God searches for us quite as much as we search for God, that starts to make sense, and so becomes a kind of adventure.
Thank you so much for taking the time with all of my questions. I have to bite my tongue now, so I'll just keep on going. Kai, do you want to jump in?
I just want to follow on from what you're saying, Mark. So if we can imagine somebody's listening to this, whenever they may do, next week, next month, next year, whenever it is that the divine whispers in their ear, I guess, they're standing on the sort of metaphorical riverbank, and they want to dip their toe in the river. Because I wouldn't say a swimming pool, because God is flowing, right? What would you say to them if they're like, "Oh, I really want to go into that river"? I'm using it obviously because of the baptism and everything. That it doesn't have to be Christianity. I want to feel God. I want to be touched by God. I want to be immersed in God. I want to flow with God. I want to see where God or the divine or whatever word one wants to use. And they're on that bank and they're digging their toes in and there's mud between their toes. And they're like, I don't know, because everything, university beat God out of me. I read like a certain Stoic book and it beat God out of me. My parents beat God out of me. Like my religious baggage beat God out of me. Like, what would you say to them as they clench their toes and it squelches in the mud, and you just need to say to them like 2 or 3 things and they just take the plunge? What would it be that you would tell them?
I would say use your body. Here's the first thought, at least. Go on a pilgrimage. Try lighting a candle. Try bowing to something. Prostrating yourself even. And rather than automatically assuming that's some kind of superstitious jettisoning of your rational mind, treat it as collaborating with your rational mind. And so that reason, instead of being sovereign, and as you say, kind of trashing what it doesn't like, start to use it as discerning what's going on. And, using your body to, be led by the heart as much as the head. If something feels awkward, it may be because you're at the cusp of realizing something new, not because it's a cul-de-sac or a bad way to go. Strong emotions are often often originate from the boundary between what's conscious and what's unconscious, so the psychotherapists would say, which is why we're kind of interested in emotion. And if they can be held and discerned, then they become the path. So again, this is an old insight. Pascal, famously said, if you want to believe in God, go to mass. Nowadays that's regarded as confirmation bias or something like that. And it might be, these things do have to be discerned. But there's another truth in that, which is that we're immersed in this world. And so to find ways of immersing yourself into worlds that can feel strange, even objectionable, there may be something there to discover. To put it another way, it's no surprise that many people in the West, say, might travel to a place like India and suddenly feel divine stirring within them, because they're in a place where that is alive and palpable still, and it's being physically there that their soul resonates with it as well. So use practices in the broader sense, not just these good cognitive practices that try and sort your mind out, but as the ancient philosophers said, there was a whole school called the Peripatetics, the wanderers. They knew that we're not one or the other, but that we're both and.
I absolutely love that. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
I know, Sharon, that you love it more than me, so I'll let you speak now.
Well, this is kind of a cognate of Kai's question, and in a way you've started to answer this, but and also Mark, just thank you so much. I have learned so much from you already, and it's such a pleasure to meet you live and in person, sort of. I'm interested in your thoughts about prayer. What do you think it's for? And how does a person who isn't an experienced prayer pray?
Yeah, well, again, to be a bit biographical, I think I learned more about prayer from another tradition than I really did from the Christian tradition, at least as it kind of came to me. Because certainly if you go to church, which I did a lot at one point, prayer is usually framed as petitions. Right. Yeah. It's the intercessory prayer. Now, someone would immediately say that praise is prayer and so on as well, but really the dominant mode that comes across is petitionary prayer. And whilst it's very human to pray for others, one of the troubles with it is that it emphasizes the separation between mortals and the immortal, between God and humanity. It's like we're pleading for this divine absence to turn towards us. And so it was deeply unhelpful to me, actually, I'd seen now in retrospect, to have that as the implicit, at least dominant mode of understanding prayer. And even though I was quite involved with monastic groups, communities, intentional communities at one point, we didn't really know what we were doing when we tried to do silent prayer. We sort of knew there was something in it, but we just basically sort of stuck it out and hoped something might show up, and it never really did. But it was when I got onto the mindfulness movement, and partly through my psychotherapy training, one of our teachers was quite into mindfulness. And so I did a 3-year course actually with an organization called the Mindfulness Association, which was quite connected to a Tibetan group. And there learned just how you can learn to meditate like you can learn to ride a bike. It's about sitting, it's about breathing, it's about attention, and it's about more human things like kindness and so on as well. And there was just enough of the religious background in this training that I did to know that it wasn't just about me and my mind kind of trying to control my ups and downs in my skull, but was coming out of a living tradition and connecting to broader dynamics too. So that then took me back to the Christian tradition, and indeed even before Christian. I remember discovering that it's not said of Plato, but Plato's successor in the academy was known to meditate for about an hour a day. Somewhere, I forget where exactly, it says that he would disappear into his hut and come out about an hour later. And then, of course, there's all these traditions about Socrates going silent and as if lost. And often in philosophy, that sort of talks about trance. It's seen as some sort of exceptional state, something a bit weird and odd. But when you realize that you can go into a different state of consciousness, and that posture, stillness, and so on is partly what enables that, it changed that for me. I realized that this was just part and parcel of Socrates' every day. Jesus is said to have gone into the wilderness to withdrawn and so on. And all his prayers, apart from the one that's best known, the Our Father in the New Testament, are about silent prayer. Go into the secret place where your Father is in secret, and so on. Don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. All these metaphors too. So that sense of stillness became important, and it was partly therapeutic. Just to, I hope, completely answer your question. It was partly therapeutic, and that I remember going on quite one of these long retreats you can do. The great revelation for me was that my mind changed hugely over the course of those days. And indeed, from hour to hour, I'd go into one sitting session and feel quite blissed out. Then 3/4 of an hour later, I'd be back in another sitting session and feel completely agitated and not be able to settle at all. And just the awareness that the mind changes very dramatic. That in itself was quite a relief, because when you're in an agitated state of mind, you realize it's not going to last. And so you just sort of grip your chair and wait for it to go. But then more broadly, when I moved on a bit from the Buddhist traditions and really discovered the theistic Indian traditions, in particular the Vedantic traditions, then the stillness could be experienced as the stillness of the divine presence within you. And that figures then like Meister Eckhart in the Christian tradition start making sense, where they talk about my eye and God's eye is one eye, or that deep within the heart of the soul is the uncreated stillness, or John of the Cross's idea of the dark night of the soul, which is often taken to be a terrible turbulent time, and that's there. But what John advises is that in the heart of that turbulence, you hold on to the darkness that's the still presence of God in the midst of that storm. And so the storm is also the revelation of the divine darkness that guides and that starts to shine. It's because you've let go of, or you're being forced to, maybe in your suffering, and letting go what you held on to. But something else shows up underneath that, through that, within that. So that meditation moment didn't just make more sense of prayer, but actually then became crucial to this felt sense of connection with the divine as well, that once you see it, you start to realize it's right through all these traditions.
Wow.
Mark, thank you so very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for asking about it.
Kai, have you got to head off now, or do you have time to ask one more question? Or
I do not have time to ask one more question, but I will be listening to the Q&A. So I'm really, okay. It's such a lovely thing to have a discussion about, especially like for me as well, especially because Ramadan started today. It's like the fasting is tomorrow. So I feel like, yeah, exactly. Go literally do what Mark said, like go and physically walk there and prostrate. And I feel, wow. So I'm really, it was wonderful. We don't have enough of these kind of conversations, I think, in contemporary strokes, in contemporary circles. Let's say we don't discuss that. And I just wanted to highlight, we're not saying if you happen to be agnostic or atheistic, we're not saying that your journey is not valid. That's not what we're saying. I just wanted to highlight, in case we get some of the emails. It's just nice to hear Mark show the historical context, the cultural context, and the spiritual context of a journey that everyone is invited to embark at some point by the divine. Thank you so much, Mark.
Hey,
Thank
no,
you,
well,
guys.
thank you, Kai, because you reached out to me. I was a bit thought modern Stoicism didn't have anything much to do with God anymore. I'd sort of had my attempt to write about it a few years back, and well, I wasn't aware of a reception particularly warm or particularly rejecting, actually, but nonetheless, it was very good to hear from you a few months back, and it's lovely to join you guys. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Mark, thank you so much, Kai. I think that that's probably a good place to transition into our Q&A period. So for all those who are listening on the podcast, I guess I'll just say you can get the full interview and Q&A on the Walled Garden if you become a member there. But Mark, I don't think you realize what you've gotten yourself into here, because Kai has introduced you to us, but now you're going to have to deal with me emailing you every week until you agree to come and spend a lot more time with us here in the Walled Garden, because we are so we're really dedicated to revivifying a lot of these ideas for people in our modern world. And I mean, the cool thing about what we're doing here, I think, is that, we've got Sharon, who very much draws her water from the Jewish path, or even as she mentioned earlier, the Jewish mysticism paths. Kai, as he's just mentioned, he's heading off to do his prayer for Ramadan. He's a Stoic Muslim, and I'm trying to rediscover for myself that Christian path because it's the closest thing to me. I mean, I grew up as a Christian, so you might as well start there. And but nonetheless, we all come together through Stoicism because we recognize that Stoicism offers that spiritual path as well, regardless of whether or not Dante puts Seneca in purgatory. I think he does, or at least at the start. But maybe I do want to open it up to Q&A now. If anybody has any questions, please just raise your hand. And while you're doing that, I have to say, Sharon, you'll find this interesting as well. I want to tell Kai this, because Kai mentioned going down into the river of spirituality, into the river of God, right? And one of the ways that I kind of think about the Logos is even just in terms of our names. Like Sharon and Kai, they'll know, as soon as I started working with them, Mark, I looked up the meaning of their names, and I was like, here's what your name means, just so that you're aware. Like Kai means warrior, and that makes so much sense because he is such a warrior. He'll take on the fight. Sharon means fertile plains or fertile valley, I believe, which is so very fitting for Sharon. But I thought it's interesting when Kai mentioned going down to the river. So my name, Simon, means he has heard, right? Jordan means to go down, to descend, right? Evans means God has been gracious, and Drew means wise. So I almost feel like my name offers me a path where it's like, hey, Simon, listen, go down, receive God's grace, find some wisdom. And so for me, I'm like, that's kind of like my own path of Logos, almost like, oh, this is the names that my parents gave me. I'm going to try and follow that path. But yeah, Sharon, I'm going to throw it over to you if you have any more questions, seeing as nobody else has raised their hand yet.
I could say something about Dante
please,
and Stoicism if you want.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. But Sharon, if you shall I
No,
just burble for a
I
moment
would
or two
much
and then
rather
come back?
Okay.
Yeah, because the best known Stoic that Dante encounters in the Divine Comedy is Cato. And Cato greets Dante and Virgil when they return from the Inferno, when they emerge at the foothills of Mount Purgatory. And it's one of those brilliant moments in Dante where the first saved person that they meet is not even a Christian. And moreover, Cato is described as his face shining with the light, first of all, of the 4 stars of the Southern Hemisphere. So these are the 4 stars of the classical virtues, it was thought. But then catching the light of the rising sun, because it's dawn on Easter morning. And you only catch the light of the rising sun if you're able to reflect the sun, which of course spiritually means that Cato is reflecting the divine light. And So this is one of the moments where Dante's saying, look, there's a whole lot more now that I've got to grapple with and understand. And in fact, I think it's going to change his whole perception of the Inferno, because remember that when you travel to dark places, you have to be darkened yourself. So all that you see is shaped by that darkness. So the Inferno is not a kind of literal description of who's there. It's a portrayal of who Dante, through his own projections, sees there, to use the modern psychotherapeutic expression. But as his perception broadens and transforms and so on, particularly in the Paradise, he starts to see that all that old perception was deeply mistaken. And Cato is a leading figure. Cato's presented quite interestingly because he's a bit confused, even whilst he's deeply regarded and is clearly a sort of old sage. But I think this is Dante's version of this shift of consciousness, that the old sage Cato is realizing that things have moved on from his time, if you like, that something new is emerging. And in particular, they talk quite a lot about the difference between rule and love. And Cato knows that there's a harmony, there's a pattern, there's the logos in the cosmos, but is learning that love can navigate a path that is resonant with the logos, but can also transcend the logos and make other patterns and possibilities viable too. And so that a virgin in particular asks Cato to remember the love of his wife and grant them passage. And I think that's hugely significant, that stirring love in Cato's heart is a way for this new realization to be stirred that little bit more in him as well. So yeah, it's one of these very, very rich moments where it's one of the first really clear moments where you realize that actually all peoples are going to be drawn to this divine light. It's one of the moments in the Divine Comedy where Christian universalism, I think, starts to make its presence felt.
Christian universalism, as in the realization that divine light may be shined through individuals from many traditions.
Yeah, the God will be all in all, as St. Paul puts it. It's not the story that Dante begins with, because it was the common assumption in his day that some people were condemned and others were saved, but that by understanding the nature of these dynamics, by experiencing them, you start to realize how you can have a very narrow view, and that can grow and encompass more and more.
Wow, Sharon, I'm going to throw it over to you because I want more of your questions. Otherwise, I'll just keep on rambling with my questions here.
Well, Mark, I'm just digesting what you just said, but we have limited time, so I'm going to put that on a shelf. How have your personal monastic experiences inform how you live now as a person in the world?
Yeah, I think that my practice as a psychotherapist now, which involves, being with people virtually or in the room, and trying to listen at a deeper level, is quite monastic. I regard it as a personal practice, as much as a kind of a therapeutic process that might help someone else, and feel that kind of rhythm, whilst in one way is very different from the monastic rhythms, is nonetheless trying to be in the world but not quite of the world. And I'd say forms the heart of my life now. I mean, I kind of, when you become a psychotherapist, you have to sort of organize your life so that you can have these periods in this slightly different consciousness. And In my earlier days as a psychotherapist, I used to try and I thought it was better to maybe see 3 people a day and then have time to write as well. And I realized that was too exhausting, because it's about shifting consciousness too many times a day. And so now I see people for 3 days a week, and then that leaves me 2 days to write and do other things. But the day becomes a kind of deep dive into the psychotherapeutic zone, if you like. And, it feels a bit like going into the enclosure or into the abbey. In a monastery, there's different parts of it which aren't just about ordering community life, although, when you've got lots of people living together, you need that kind of order, but are about stepping across thresholds into different kinds of consciousnesses as well. And so I think of, my kind of therapy room as a bit like going into the abbey. And it helps me to listen in and be ready. And that'd be one part of it for sure.
That's such a powerful message, though, right? That there's this, I really needed to hear that. Separate a few days to be in certain frames of consciousness. I'm going to go now and put all of my clients on like 2 days. I'm doing this straight away, because that makes so much sense that you would shift and intentionally, right? Today I'm here doing this. That's just really important. I want to say, Judith, you're just as much as the part of our community as anyone else now. Even Sharon and Kaiman, you're working with us. In Soul Searching with Seneca, and definitely making your way to be the head of classics. So is what I want for you. But do you have any questions? I'm sure your mind's just been going all over the place with these answers.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Simon. I guess I'd like to just ask Mark to talk a little bit more about Dante, because it would be great to hear a bit more about his insights into that great work.
Yeah, well, it's where to start really, but I mean, Dante became really important to me. Again, part of this, linking back to what Simon was saying earlier about how this whole thing becomes experiential, because I knew that the Divine Comedy was one of the great works of the Christian tradition, and wanted to try and get into it, and had failed, on a handful of occasions when I tried. I just couldn't make sense of it. And then when I was in my own analysis, and was in, kind of the darkest place of that, and as luck would have it, joined a group reading the Divine Comedy with a great teacher who week by week took us canto by canto, used illustrations, really opened up the labyrinth for us. And that wasn't just wonderful for its own sake, but actually really helped me to try and find a way out of the darkness of my own therapy. I had quite a traditional psychoanalysis, and it was very good for the descent, but I think wasn't so sure about the ascent on the other side, actually. And so it was very timely for me to realize certain things that Dante makes so clear. And one of them, which is now quite a sort of truism of the spiritual path, is that, but relates to this business of time again, which is that we can be very preoccupied with the past or worried about the future, to such an extent that the present almost doesn't exist in our psyches. And sure enough, one of the things that becomes clear to Dante in the Inferno is that no one changes, everyone's stuck in hell, not because a god is condemned, but because there's no present in hell. Everyone's either preoccupied with their pasts, they want revenge, or they're terrified, or whatever it might be, or they're preoccupied with the future. And it means that there's no present, and the present is the only moment where they can actually change. And there's every so often there's like a half moment where someone in hell kind of looks at Dante and squints, and then sort of falls back again. And it's almost like they've realized that there's a present moment in the person of Dante right in front of them, but they don't know how to hold on to it. They can't make anything of it. Whereas in the purgatory, there's still suffering and struggle, but people are able to attend to what that's actually doing to them right now, not what it was like earlier or what they fear it might be like in the future. And just that slight adjustment starts to make all the difference. And so, you know, for me personally, that meant I could start to feel how certainly the past was greatly shaping my present, but that the present might start to be a bit different too. And as a British psychotherapist, Donald Winnicott put it, one of the great realizations in psychotherapy is that, as he puts it, the breakdown has already happened. You're in psychotherapy because at some point something went very wrong, or wrong, you know, just went wrong in some way or other, to whatever degree. We'd now call it trauma. And but although that trauma has a certain timeless quality, and so can, unchecked, just live on and on and on and keep ruining a life, when you start to see that the trauma happened, it means that the present has got that extra bit of space where something new might start to come in. And then that changes the relationship with what happened. It starts to have a bit of a narrative. You can see that it belonged to an earlier part of your life and you're different now, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, there were parallels in purgatory, as Dante describes it, with the people that he encounters there. So that was it made sense because it tightly connected to my own experience, and it began to feel like it was guiding me somewhere. Not directly, you know, I didn't have visions of ascending terraces up Mount Purgatory or anything, but experientially again. And in fact, you know, it's because Dante describes it in a certain kind of way that is alive, but because it's also different, that gives you space to bring on your own experience that parallels. So it's not an imitation. It's again a sympathy, a kind of resonance, and that too is really important, because then that gives you space to make something of it yourself, even as you recognize you're following a path that's been walked many times before, which of course is really good for hope and encouragement.
Mark, I might ask a question here as well, just in relation to something you said there, when you said, you know, these souls sitting up, squinting at Dante and then just kind of falling back. It kind of made me think in a different direction. That's sort of what a lot of people do with Dante's Divine Comedy. You know, even thinking of what Rupert Sheldrake said to you in your first conversation with him, he said, you know, like I've looked at it a few times, but just didn't quite understand it. And then I had to, you know, he kind of stopped reading it. And I think, look, take it from me, somebody who has really not spent the time that I should with this work. But even just thinking about what we do with this work today, which is we chop it up and, you know, now we sell it separately as the Inferno because that's the most popular part. And I'm guilty of being one of those people who bought just the Inferno and not the latter parts of this work. Even though something in me thought, why are they breaking this up? Why are they chopping this up into its parts? But I think you understand, obviously, on a bit of a deeper level, that there is profound truth to be found in the ascent of this work. What do you think it says about our modern times that we don't, like you said at the start, we don't quite understand or don't quite appreciate the garden element of this work as much as some of the more exciting stuff, you might say?
Yeah, I guess it's partly commercial reasons that mean it's chopped up these days. Although the Divine Comedy did appear bit by bit as Dante released it, as it was copied, and he did write the Inferno first. And And in fact, when he died, this is a rather nice story. When he died, the last 20 or so cantos of the Paradise were lost. And the story is, and it's quite early attested, so I like to think it's true, that Dante, after his death, appeared to one of his sons and told his son where the final 20 cantos were. And they were in a kind of crevice or a niche in the wall that was behind a stove that no one had ever looked behind, and so on. And sure enough, they were found there. And there is some sense as to why Dante might have hidden them, because the last 20 cantos are really where his challenging of Christian orthodoxy completely takes off. He sees all sorts of people in paradise that the church would not have wanted people to know were there. It's partly the history of the document, I guess. But it is, I think, also that we live in a hellish world. Where, well, even in therapy and psychotherapy, and even in maybe self-help, the goal is set as getting through life. It's not discovering another world that's also here. And even in a lot of more spiritual parts of the self-help world, it's as much, about you becoming the cosmos rather than, being open so the cosmos can come to you. I'm thinking of things like manifesting, which seem to me to get it completely the wrong way round. It's like you can ask for whatever you want, missing out the element that if you can divest yourself of what you think you want, you discover a whole lot more that you really do want. But it requires that divesting process.
Or perhaps the cosmos wants for you, right?
Why would we think that our narrow desires might be capable of desiring all that it's possible to desire? It's kind of strange. Well, it's consumerism. That's what consumerism teaches you, so maybe it's not surprising at all. But it is also true, and Dante does say this, that the paradise is the most difficult part. And he says, if you've got this far, great, but just ask yourself, do I really want to follow you all the way now? Because he says, if you get lost on the seas of paradise, it's far worse, actually, than getting lost elsewhere in the Divine Comedy. And I think a kind of parallel there would be getting lost in, say, peak experiences. And seeking one height after another and not being able to incorporate them into your life because you haven't got the means to discern them. And that is a real danger now, which you see, with the use of psychedelics or whatever else it might be. Or even, the dream that you'll find a romantic partner who will somehow, make your life perfect. You'll get lost in love. Dante certainly thinks love is absolutely fundamental, but it's love combined with the mind, with the intellect, so that you can trace what at first seem these subtler and subtler lights and realize they lead to the source of all light. So it's partly the world we live in, but it's also partly because the adventure doesn't stop with paradise. In a way, it only just begins then, which is one of the reasons why I love the Divine Comedy too, actually. Because sometimes the paradise is just talked about as if it's just one glowing description of light after another. And certainly when I thought I might be able to speak and write about the Divine Comedy, I was a bit worried that I might not find much more than just what a lovely way he expresses the sunrise, which he does, it's true. But it was it was transformative for me to really, not just to read it, but to think, what am I going to say about this? And you can only really speak when you at least sense something from your own experience of what's going on.
Mark, I think this is a good place to wrap this up, and just to say thank you so much. This is, what a pleasure for us to have your insights here today. And So, on behalf of everybody in the Walled Garden, just thank you so much. And this is, if it be your will, this is not the end of our relationship with Mark Vernon in the Walled Garden, because we want to have many more conversations just like this. And it's been quite profound. Sharon, did you want to say anything before we wrap up?
Just such a pleasure. Go well, Mark. Go well, everyone. I'm grateful to all of us being together for each other in this time.
Yeah, well,
Bye for now, but love always.
Let me just chip in a big thanks too, because the truth is, it's only when we share these things in the dialogue that the third thing appears in between us and amongst us. So these gatherings are absolutely not just a pleasure, but are really fundamental, actually, because you feel it stirring within yourself as you listen and speak and try and respond and track and so on. So it's really, this is the work. What we're doing, what you're organising and running right now is the thing. So it's really important, and I'd be delighted to come back again as and when.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. If you'd like to attend any of our free meetups and events, or if you'd like to get one-on-one mentoring with either Sharon LaBelle, Kai Whiting, or myself, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, don't forget to nourish those gardens in your mind.